on a beautiful Sunday morning. This is Media Monitor, the show that monitors and gives analysis of media coverage to some of the leading stories of the week. I am your host, Alicia Jadi. We're live right here on Channel 44, that's SABC News. In our lineup today, we'll start by discussing today's newspaper headlines. We analyze the Oscar Pistorius trial's closing arguments at the mitigation of sentence. The horrific accident in Alberton raises safety questions in this transport month. There are mixed reactions about Winnie Madikizela Mandela's Unwe state claim. And also, is Ebola a threat to the 2015 AFCON tournament? In other news making headlines, Xolile Mngeni, one of the men convicted of the killing of the Swedish bride Annie Devani on her honeymoon in South Africa, has died in prison. Now, to unpack media coverage today, we welcome our senior veteran journalist, Mr. Joe Tlolwe, who is the director in the Press Council, as well as Mr. Raymond Lowe. He's the chairperson of MISA South Africa, and of course, Mr. Wadim Schreiner. He's the head of analysis at Onico Group, and later we will be joined in studio by Mr. William Bird, the director at Media Monitoring Africa. Now, to join in at discussions and share your views, you can call us on the following numbers: +2711 714 6843. 714-6847, 714-6857. You can also interact with us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor, and of course, like our Facebook page, Media Monitor. A very good morning to you. All right, now, before we get into discussion with the stories that made headlines throughout the week, let's first take a look at today's newspaper headlines. Panel, a very good morning to you, and so thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
All right, panel, let's start with the City Press headline. The City Press headline reads, ANC's Limpopo war cry. Mr. Raymond Lowe, let's start with you. What are your views about this headline, sir?
Well, it's a fine headline. And, of course, it indicates a difficulty that the ANC is facing, that one of its provinces is finding or contending the kind of help that the ANC as a government is extending towards it by complaining about the administration group that was sent to run the administration of Limpopo when it got into difficulties. And they are saying that this administration group is not doing its job properly and not helping it. And they are complaining.
Wadim, your views?
Well, it's clearly we're getting towards election time again. We just had it behind us, but we've got elections coming up in 2 months' time. And we can see that if we're also picking up on the, for instance, Sunday Independent headline, which deals with the ANC 29 billion problem, it's either e-tolls or Joburg as ruling party prepares for crucial 2016 elections. So that is basically linked to it. We're already talking about the provincial and the local elections that we're basically having in 2 years' time. And there's a couple of very important decisions that have to go and be taken. So that's why we're talking about it. That's why those two stories in the papers.
Yes, on the e-tolling side, of course, there's also the large difference of opinion between Gauteng and the ANC, with Gauteng wanting against the e-tolling system. And, of course, that places the government in a difficult position.
Look at it. I mean, COSATU was protesting about the e-tolls just yesterday, claiming that they will demolish them. Is there any progress in terms of media coverage of that story, Wadim?
Well, I think there's a lot of media coverage around that. I think Outa and Wayne Duvenage are, pumping on social media and through other media quite a lot of coverage. We do obviously have quite a little coverage on kind of the other side in terms of what comes out of the panel. The African National Congress obviously divided, and Mr. Lowe stated that there's a divide. The ANC in Gauteng is in support of looking at alternative measures of collection. Nationally, it's a bit of a different story. It's very difficult. I think we are now at a very crucial point where something is going to have to go and happen in the next 2 to 3 months. A decision has to go and happen, and it's going to be a very carefully drafted decision because it's going to go and impact significantly on the next months going forward.
All right, now let's look at, of course, the Sunday Times headline. South Africa's #1 coward. Mr. Lowe, your views on that?
Well, I think it's a great story.
Tell us why, sir.
I'm not entirely sure that you could describe Mr. Zuma as a coward. I mean, his record, of course, shows that he is anything but a coward. But he is being very careful about what's happening in Parliament. But he doesn't want to endure the kind of treatment that he endured the last time when the Malema party almost shouted him down in a sense and said, pay up or else, pay up, pay up, pay up, preventing him from being able to maintain his presence in the Parliament or even answer a question. And of course the cowardice relates to the fact that it doesn't want to answer any more questions, and he's got to answer questions 4 times a year, and he's only done it once, and on that particular occasion, he left before the question time was over, and now he doesn't want to have another one. And the DA, quite rightly, are criticizing it. I think it's going a little far to call him a coward, but nevertheless, he is acting as he shouldn't act. He is, in fact, skipping his duties.
Wadim, do you want to add on that?
Difficult to go and add, but obviously it's a continuation of the story. We have the focus on our president going forward. This is not the latest one. Before we had it more in his personal capacity and the money that has allegedly been spent and him avoiding certain questions to it. Now we're moving into the space of his responsibilities as a president in terms of parliament and the alleged failure. Therefore, I think there's quite a lot of angles that are going to be taken now by the press focusing on him. And the longer this goes on, the more difficult it's going to go and be to go and handle the various aspects. And again, if we're looking at the other issues that we've mentioned, Limpopo, Gauteng, it's going to be an interesting year ahead, not just for the president, but for the press as well, in terms of how they're handling that.
Mr. Tlholo, I know you really can't say much in terms of the media, but we will get into the stories with you. But let's look at the report headline. Gentlemen, Jooste se pyn na dag van hoop. Here's a feel-good story that report is running with. Shouldn't we see more of positive reporting, especially on Sunday morning, gentlemen? Mr. Lowe.
I didn't see that story at all.
All right.
I've skimmed it, and I'm not even sure if it is a positive story. I mean, obviously, I wasn't following the rugby too much, but I believe that Joos van der Westhuizen was able to go and walk onto the field, aided, and it was a positive story, the fact that he was still there. And obviously, the condition that he is in is a very difficult condition, and we've got this photograph of him with his 2 children, and then it's a big tragedy what happens to him. But what is good about this tragedy is, again, that it brings attention to the actual disease that he's facing, that we're again talking about something that has to go and be there. And I admire him for stepping out. He doesn't look at all like the Joos van der Westhuizen that we know from the great rugby days, and it's amazing that the photographs of him with his kids are on the front pages. I think it's very, very telling, very, very good.
Yes, he's shown a great deal of courage in tackling this disease and in dealing with it in a very positive way, by going out and meeting people and telling them about it and what you do and how you try and face up to it.
Yeah.
All right,
great admiration there.
All right, now, gentlemen, of course, in the Davani trial, there's been a new development. The murder accused has died in prison. What are your views in terms of what you're going to see in coverage, Mr. Lowe?
In coverage, well, we've got the coverage that the fact that the man has died. The question is, how would that affect the evidence given against Duani by the prosecution? Now, I have the impression that this man was so ill that he was unlikely to be a witness anyway. So I don't think, in that sense, that it's going to have any material difference on the prosecution. But the prosecution appears to be in some difficulty in presenting its case because nobody seems to know who fired the bullet.
Very interesting that this should actually happen at such a crucial stage of this trial. Wadim, what are your views?
Yeah, it is difficult. I mean, what the court now has to go in July is basically under court proceedings when the initial court case against the alleged murderer took place. Now, that is very difficult because now the defense obviously can go and start challenging some of the aspects, but you no longer have got the possibility of cross-examining the actual person in there. It does weaken the case, and I agree with Mr. Lowe that the case at this point in time seems to be stumbling along. It's not as hard hitting, and it's obviously too early to go and preempt in which direction this court is going to go, but it certainly at this point of time doesn't really look as if the state has got a case that's going to be hard hitting, which is really, really bad because it took such a long time and such an amount of money to go and make this case happen. Yeah, let's go and see what happens.
Mr. Tlholo, if I can just ask you, how should the media be covering this case now at such a crucial time?
I think they should be observing all the requirements that they should observe, covering the case factually without anticipating the judgment.
Very interesting indeed. Now, gentlemen, again, here's another story that we need to look at. Of course, it's the Oscar Pistorius trial. Sentencing is due on Tuesday. What are your feelings there, Mr. Lowe?
Well, we'll wait with it with bated breath. I wouldn't like to speculate on what potential sentence the judge is likely to hand down. There's been so much argument about that, and it's very difficult. It's all in the judge's hands. The cases for a rather, shall we say, a non-custodial sentence has been strongly put and strongly made. There's been an equally strong case for a custodial sentence. So it's very difficult to say what the judge is going to do. Of course, one of the things that has not appeared very frequently in the press is the fact that the judge is not making the decision on her own. She's sitting with two assessors, and there will be a discussion between the three of them. So it is, in a sense, a joint decision that will be handed down on Tuesday, of the views of three people, not just one person.
And I think, like Mr. Tlole rightfully said, that we need to let these things play out in court before we as media even go out to judge. What do you...
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the report sums it up, and the report is normally a publication similar to Beale that jumps very quickly to conclusion and declares somebody either guilty or not guilty. And I think what they've done in this particular case, saying Khan Oscar sit of Glai, and they've done a graphic with him in his suit, and one half is in the suit, and the other one is in the prison orange jumpsuit. And I think even the report has been very, very careful in saying which ways it goes. And if the report doesn't go and make a call, then we all need to know that we need to go and sit tight back and wait for Tuesday, 9 o'clock.
All right. Well, that's it on our newspaper segment. And of course, you can give us those calls and tell us what you think about today's newspaper headlines. And of course, which stories you think were generally covered very well by the media. Come on, let's give credit when it's due. We're going to take a very quick ad break. And when we return, we're going to discuss the coverage of the commemoration of Black Wednesday. Do share your views and comments on Twitter at SA Media Monitor and like our Facebook page, Media Monitor. Don't go anywhere.
SABC News delivers stories that
unify the nation
in many ways, stories that inspire us
to see the world differently, appreciate
and celebrate our diversity.
And mostly,
They make this place a better country to live in
despite our color,
beliefs
or culture.
I'm
I am
Mahendra Raghunath.
Tabile Wado.
Lulu Kabu.
Join us every day
As we provide updates on
local and international news.
Straight into your home.
We
are
are SABC News.
SABC, sharing 20 years of inspiration.
Welcome back to Media Monitor. You can also be part of the Black Wednesday commemoration discussion by calling us on +2711 714 6843, 714 6847 and 714 6857, and let us know which other stories you feel were not adequately covered by the media, or that the stories that were very, very well covered. Let us give credit where it's due. Once again, now today marks exactly 37 years of the commemoration of media freedom in South Africa. Back in 19 October 1977, the apartheid regime banned a number of newspapers and publications. Scores of activists and journalists were jailed for challenging the regime. The move was an attempt to silence all those exposing the apartheid regime's dirty work. Gentlemen, once again, thank you so much for joining us. Now, this is directed at our veteran journalists, and of course, we're very honored to have both of you here in studio. Mr. Tlole, if you can just explain to us, I would like to understand what exactly is Black Wednesday?
Black Wednesday is the day we remember the worst day as far as freedom of expression in this country is concerned. We remember the day the government closed down 16 organizations and 3 publications, The World, Weekend World, and Pro Veritate, and jailed the editor of the Sowetan, the deputy editor, and a whole lot of other journalists. And that was a black day for democracy in this country.
Mr. Raymond Lowe, in your views?
Well, exactly. It was a black day and a very shocking day, not only in terms of the journalists who were arrested, but closing a newspaper of the stature of the World and the Weekend World. Of course, that led to the birth of the Sowetan, which is now occupying a very important place in the newspaper world. But it it was a moment when journalists were shocked at what the government, the extent to which the government would go. There was no charges preferred against these journalists. They were merely detained and they were kept in jail for a long time. One of the organizations that was banned was the UBJ, the Union of Black Journalists, of which Joe was then president. And despite the fact that they banned the organization, he was already in jail. He was, I think, in Howick, in KwaZulu-Natal, also under a detention order with no basis in terms of a charge. Journalists, of course, as a result of that, were rather apprehensive as to what may happen. By merely criticizing the government and its policies and apartheid, one could land in jail. But despite that, the criticism developed again. And of course, we eventually went to a stage where things changed rapidly in the 1990s. But it took a long time. That was 13 years afterwards. But of course, there wasn't only Percy Kabozo, who was the editor of The World at the time. There was also Donald Woods, who was banned. He wasn't imprisoned, but he was banned. And that, of course, came a month after Steve Biko was murdered in jail, and the newspapers reported it about it being a potential murder, while the government was saying that he had gone on a hunger strike and died, and that had caused his death.
Mr. Tlole, please tell us about your personal experiences as a black journalist back then.
Those were rough days. As Raymond says, when they banned the Union of Black Journalists, I was already in jail. I had been in jail since February that year, under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, which meant that I couldn't get any visitors, I couldn't get any reading material, I couldn't get any lawyers, and I was being interrogated very brutally during that period. So that was the experience of journalism. We didn't have the freedoms that we have now, the freedom of expression that we have now. And that's why this day is so important, that every citizen should stand for a minute and say, this will never, ever happen again in this country.
We're going to continue on that. Let's take Zig from Randburg on the line. Zig, a very good morning to you. Please make it very quickly.
Good morning, Alicia.
Morning,
I'm
Zig.
so grateful for this opportunity. I wanted to point out that you've got two giants, two enormous giants of the South African press of South African media on your TV at the moment, and we must honor them with everything we've got. I'm not sure if they've even got any Mapungubwe awards at this stage yet. They need the highest honor of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's Zig out there. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you, gentlemen, the then Justice Minister, Mr. Jimmy Kruger, was saying that the publications were publishing inflammatory material that threatened the nation's security. What did it mean, Mr. Tlole?
Anything that was against the government was inflammatory to them. They expected everybody to accept what they were doing and what they were saying as gospel. In fact, I think a few years later, I think 3 years later, they virtually banned another publication which was the successor to The World, that's Post-Transvaal. So that at that point, anything you said against government was in fact regarded as inflammatory.
They regarded as undermining white domination.
Mr. Lowe, that's the question I want to pose to you. For you, were you fighting for the same challenges that the black journalists were facing in that time?
I don't know if we're fighting for the same challenges, but we were certainly fighting against apartheid and pointing out why apartheid couldn't work and why it shouldn't work, both the moral and the practical disadvantages of apartheid, and we concentrated quite heavily on the moral side, that this was no way in which people should be treated. And that's what we did, and quite a number of English language newspapers did that. Of course, we came under the whip of the Afrikaans press at that time for doing that. They, in fact, accused us of virtually treasonable activities, of trying to bring down the Nationalist Party government and try to undermined South Africa's way of life. That was the criticism against the English press. But that had to be done, as we thought as journalists.
Mr. Tlole, what have been some of the biggest breakthroughs achieved for media freedom in South Africa? Can we sit and say after 20 years of democracy, we've reached that place?
We have reached that place in the sense that freedom of expression, freedom of the media are guaranteed in the Constitution. Don't be very easy for any government to remove those. And even when we face minor challenges, the chances of that being implemented, those challenges turning into reality are very slim because we have a strong constitutional court that will defend the Constitution. So we have won a tremendous amount. But what's worrying is that these little challenges are the ones that make South Africa's status to be downgraded as far as press freedom is concerned. But in practice, this country enjoys media freedom, something that we fought for all those years.
Yes, but he talks about being downgraded. That is Freedom House, the New York-based monitor of press freedom throughout the world, downgraded us 2 years or 3 years ago from a free country, which we hadn't had a rating of that kind during the nationalist era, a free country from which we had been since 1994, to a partly free country. And that was because of the hostility shown by the government towards the media, the several laws that had been implemented or were on the statute books as bills at that time, which would impose restrictions on the media. Indeed, and there was also, of course, the conduct of state officials towards the press, the attacks by policemen on journalists and on photographers and removing photographers' cameras and the pictures from those cameras, those sorts of things which led to this downgrading. And we are very concerned that that is continuing today. In fact, the President is holding a meeting in Pretoria in an hour or two's time in which he's going to make a celebration of the contribution the media has made towards democracy in this country. And we feel that that is totally appropriate for him to do so, but at the same time he should go further and start reviewing the legislation and the conduct of state officials towards the press, so that in fact the media can be free as it should be free in terms of the Constitution.
With that in mind, yes, Mr. Tlole, go ahead.
The problem I have is with the rating organizations, that they downgrade us on the basis of threats rather than on actual implementation. We haven't seen real threats, serious threats to media freedom. It's just talk. Ultimately, that shouldn't influence the gradings at this stage.
All right, and I was just about to say, with that in mind, the secrecy bill, how would you view it? As a triumph, as an ethical measure, or what, Mr.
Well, I think
quickly?
that gainsays a little of what Joe is saying. The secrecy bill is there. It's waiting for the President's signature. It's been waiting nearly a year for that signature. And as soon as it is signed, the media and several other organizations will take that bill to the Constitutional Court to find out whether in fact it complies with the press freedom principles in the Constitution.
Gentlemen.
And I don't think it will.
All right.
But there are laws on the statute books, like the protection of personal information, which have clauses in it which could affect the press. There's been an exemption clause, but it's not totally satisfactory.
All right, Mr. Luke.
And then, of course, there is our anti-terrorism bill, which it's not been invoked, which fortunately, but it could enable the authorities to demand sources from journalists, their sources of information, confidential sources of information.
All right, just like our caller said, we really should honor our two gentlemen in studio. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you so much for your time and, of course, being on the show this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, okay, all right. Well, that's how we end our topic on Black Wednesday. And when we return, we're going to discuss the Oscar Pistorius trial and the horrific Alberton truck accident. You can still share your views and comments on Twitter at SA Media Monitor, as well as on Facebook. We'd like to thank Mr. Raymond Lowe, as well as Mr. Joe Tlole for being with us this morning. Stay with us. This is Media Monitor.
into Africa. This is the Kingdom of Swaziland. The leader is His Majesty King Mswati III. Swaziland got independent from Britain on 6 September in 1968. The population is more than 1 million people. One of the major languages spoken is English. Monetary unit is Lilangeni.
Welcome back. This is Media Monitor. You can also be part of the Oscar Pistorius sentencing and the Alberton accident discussions by calling us on the following numbers: +2 711 714 6843, 714 6847, and 714 6857. In our next story, Oscar Pistorius will learn of his fate next Tuesday, as State Prosecutor Girinel said that the Paralympian should be jailed for a minimum of 10 years to meet society's demands. We'd like to now also extend a warm welcome to Mr. William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. Mr. Bird, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Good morning. It's good to be here.
Let's start with you. I'd like to venture into this angle, panel. Since the verdict of not guilty of murder or the dolus eventualis, what have you observed in terms of the variation of coverage of the Oscar trial? Let's start with you, William.
Well, I think generally the South African media has been pretty fair in the way that they've treated him, to the extent that they've tried to give a sense of the anger that people feel about saying, well, we don't understand this. I mean, this term dolus eventualis has now entered our lexicon as though it's something that ordinary citizens understand. And
Yes.
I'm not sure that I really do understand it, precisely when you get different cases and people being let off for things that perhaps you think they shouldn't. So I think that to the extent that the media have reflected both sides, they've done a good thing, but I'm not sure that we necessarily understand some of the big questions about justice. We're seeing some of them being raised in the newspapers this morning. Revenge versus justice. What does restorative justice mean? How should we be dealing with people? What is the state of our prisons? I mean, we saw some quite comical kinds of discussions in that regard in the court, you know, with one person saying they're hideous beyond measure, you're going to get raped every other day, and others saying, well, you know, actually things that sunshine, roses and lollipops.
Now, of course, gentlemen, we're to wait for this trial to learn about the state of our prisons now. But has any journalist ventured into a prison expose and wait, is jail supposed to be comfortable or what when you go in there? Wadim?
Well, yeah, we did have a number of journalists over the past couple of years have been reporting about jail, usually as a reaction to, you know, somebody being incarcerated or not. Jackie Salebi, I recall, you know, there was some coverage in terms of, you know, the medical facilities and others. And I think it was the Mail and Guardian for the past couple of weeks has been looking at Lendlela repatriation camp, you know, for the refugee seekers and asylum seekers. So there is coverage on that. And I think we all understand that jail is not a good place. I'm not sure if we're not over-exaggerating the situation. I think,
it's
you know,
not supposed to be comfortable.
Well, it's not supposed to be comfortable. Yes, sure, we've got overcrowding, and you know, obviously it's not a good place. Look, the human rights need to be respected in jail, irrespective of what it is that you've done. And you know, there are certain instances that you know, obviously should never go and happen. And I think a lot of it is hearsay. But I think it's very important that we know more about it, because I think if we're listening to the conversation that we had just as a result of the closing arguments, there is such a difference of opinion of what is right and what is wrong, and it's a discussion that we need to go and have. Unfortunately, this is a very violent society. It's a society where a lot of people end up being incarcerated for the right reasons or for the wrong reasons, or they shouldn't perhaps be and should perhaps be out on parole. It's something that we have to go and deal with, and perhaps something that we have not dealt with, the alternatives to incarceration and the options of alleviating the full jails that we're having.
William?
I just don't think we're getting anywhere near the nuance. The fact is, if you look at it, there have been some astonishingly good stories in our media over the last couple of years around prisons and how people are treated within our prison systems. And there we need to talk in a far more comprehensive way about what it means to have power. So if you're rich and wealthy and you go to prison, you're going to be fine, because either you're going to get into the hospital section, or if you're very well connected, you'll get out of jail. Or if you're poor, you're not going to. So there's so many prisoners that are awaiting trial prisoners that the wheels of justice just grind so incredibly slowly. So if you look at some of the stories that have emerged from the Wits Justice Project, for example, where you look at people taking place over a number of years and years and years, and that's where I think The trouble with these things is this, is that these aren't one Sunday paper, 2 pieces of analysis and we're done. This is a thing that says we need to cover these issues comprehensively and we need to cover them almost all the time until we start to see some real change and start to get some understanding. So we've got a better understanding of our justice system thanks to the Oscar trial, but I don't think we've got that much better understanding of how power helps to entrench those who do have power and make sure that that justice gets done a lot more efficiently and a lot faster, which very clearly it has, as it has in the case of Shreen Dewani. But again, the issue of our prisons was raised extensively in his extradition treaty. So there we saw it. And you would think that we might have got a bit more discussion, but...
Gentlemen, I just want to raise a very interesting point here. Advocate Barry Rue blamed media for inaccurate reports, saying this has totally broken Oscar. Did media do that, or are we just being scapegoats?
Shame. I mean, no, obviously they didn't. I mean, you know, and I think Gerinel pointed that one out as well, that, you know, if you're in that limelight, you got to go and live with it, and you get the good things and the bad things of the media coverage. And again, you know, we've got to ask ourselves the question here, who's the victim? And I agree with what William has been saying. I think in this court case, we've had really, really poor covered court cases before one. This one actually was exceptionally well covered, and we can see that also in the way that the international press has been reacting. We've been hammered in previous court cases by the international press. This one we weren't, and I think it's really a case where, you know, I think the channel, the Pistorius channel on DSTV has done a great deal of education. We've had a lot of coverage in other channels to go and talk about those aspects. So to go and claim that he's received negative coverage, has been victimized, and that's been to his detriment, is a tactic that the defense is going to go and use, but at the same time a tactic that the prosecuting is going to go and use to, you know, obviously put the other side of the story. I don't think it happened.
William, I mean, again, it's an issue of hands up there.
It's again an issue of power. So, I mean, the media admitted, and we saw a couple of weeks ago, one of the newspaper's lead headline was they managed to get it was before he was sent off for his month observation at the mental institution, psychiatric evaluation. And there they got a picture of him. They'd been waiting, sitting outside his house. Now, that kind of thing does build particular pressure. But the thing, again, is that people like Oscar Pistorius are very well protected. They live in a big mansion. You can't see over the walls. They've got people, literally, that will come out and just, you know, push you gently away, or perhaps less gently away. You know, there are those kinds of systems in place that protect them. Whereas you look at ordinary citizens in situations of trauma, in situations where they lose family members, our media does still have a tendency to pry, to go into their homes, to try and get interviews with them at those awful, awful moments where they've discovered grief or death. It's still one of the reasons why the SABC's editorial policies are particularly good, because they've got a section in there that says you shall not intrude unnecessarily in people's privacy and distress in times of grief, which is it's an important thing to consider given the issues that we were discussing in the segment before this. You know, we're talking about a nation that lives in national trauma, an incredibly violent nation. So Oscar Pistorius, if anything, gets far better treatment than by our media than other ordinary citizens.
I just want to get back to your earlier point, Wadim. Have you seen much reporting about our judicial system by international media?
Surprisingly little. I mean, there's been the coverage in the court case, obviously, and I think there's been coverage on Judge Masipa, I think simply due to her own biography, where she comes from as a journalist and, you know, late joining the legal fraternity and where she is. So from that point of view, very little. I think there was a little bit of a coverage in a dolus eventualis. I think international media were as surprised that it actually exists as probably we were, and as to the interpretations. But throughout this trial, there's been a very, very to almost non-existent criticism of our judicial system, which is, you know, much needed boost that this country needs from its reputational point of view. And I believe, irrespective of how this trial is going to go and end from a sentencing, that is not going to go and change, because we also know that, you know, there's other appeal processes in place. So that's been good for South Africa, internationally speaking.
All right. Well, we're going to have to wait for Tuesday to see what the outcome is. All right. Let's move on to our next story now. Isaac Wade Muruding, the truck driver that plowed into almost 50 vehicles on the N12 Eastern near Alberton, is a repeat offender, and the truck was on the road illegally. The case has been postponed to the 22nd of October. Now, again, panel, the Pinetown truck accident last year brought a lot of media, into the media spotlight. The media questioned all the issues around who should be held responsible. Did they ever follow up and report back to us until this accident? William?
So the beauty of social media is that you've got all sorts of groups. So there are big Facebook groups that have been supporting the driver in the Pinetown incident, for example. So in terms of formal media, you're not going to find a story on that in any of our media on a daily basis in the mainstream media, but you will find something around it on social media and Facebook media, those kinds of things. And that's where I think our media should be keeping an eye on what's going on there so that they can keep public informed as to some of these things. But again, they've got a bigger role. You know, that I don't think that we kill too many people on our roads. We know this. Everyone knows this. We laugh about it in South Africa.
It's Transport Month.
It's Transport Month, and people die. And what do we get from our senior leaders? Ooh, we're shocked and we're appalled. And I mean, look, we're all shocked and appalled all the time. It's about doing things and about what are the small practical steps that people, citizens, people in authority can take to actually ensure that transport issues improve. So why is this man a repeat offender? Why was the truck on the road illegally? We see these roadblocks are being conducted. Why aren't they being conducted more effectively, more routinely on sections of road that are dangerous? Why aren't these things happening? And then again, why aren't our media investigating that? And what does it mean to actually have Transport Month? There's so many questions. Transport's a huge issue.
Yes.
Why do we have so many trucks on our road instead of on our rail system? We've got one of the most extensive railway systems, and yet it's falling apart because people don't transport things on there. So these things are all integrated, and we need to look at it. It's not as though government doesn't have integrated plans, but I don't think we have been helped really understand the bigger questions around transport.
Wadim, have you heard much around Transport Month and, of course, the issues surrounding it?
Look, I'm obviously in the media, and I work quite a lot with government, so I'm aware of Transport Month. I am just against, declaring days and months because I think it oversimplifies certain issues. We are carrying people across this country, across the provinces throughout the year. It doesn't just happen in a particular month, and the emphasis should be throughout the year. I think there's a danger to focus and peak on certain things and to go and exaggerate, and then it runs again into obscurity. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, and I can't remember, there was a particular bus company, and I don't want to name it because I can't really remember, that had over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, accidents with their buses, and people died, and there was a huge outrage in all the publications, and the bus driver and the owner and the road certificates, and we've got to go and follow this thing up, and then it all dies. And I think this is, again, if we're looking at the press, they are very, very good in investigating what it is that government does. They're very, very good on local level, provincial level, national level. But when it goes to the same thing on a corporate, on a business level, we don't have the same bite. And I believe that particular transport, as it is very important, should have that one. So press need to go out and look at, those organizations that are transporting either our goods or our people. What are they doing for road safety? What are those processes in place? How much corruption is in place? How much maintenance do we do undercover work? That doesn't happen. Way too many people die. We've got an Arrive Alive campaign, but without more and more vigorous approach and focus on those aspects, we're not going to go and change that. Government can go and do quite a lot, but it can't do everything, and we need also people on the ground, including the private sector, to look at that aspect and to go and see what happens. This is horrific, what happened in Alberton, and it will happen again. That is probably the worst case, that it will happen again.
Now, William, it says here that the RAF, of course, has reportedly assisted the families with burial arrangement, hospital stays and counselling. Very fast resolutions. Do you think it's just a PR exercise?
Well, I don't know if it's PR. I mean, I'm sure that it's perfectly legitimate. It's just we need to think about the cost of these things to our country and our economy. And we saw recently some really interesting research by KPMG on the cost of gender-based violence to our country. And that's the kind of thing we need to be looking at with the cost of road accidents. I think we've already got these figures there, and then we need to say, well, what are the things that we can do to actually improve it and make sure that, because we also know that in a few months' time we get the silly season, and we then have counters running on how many people we're going to kill this year. And if we're really lucky, we'll get a decrease instead of X thousand by 10 people less, and which again suggests that there's not any real movement in undermining and really trying to make our roads safer. And those are the questions that we need to be saying is, we have Transport Month, we have all these great campaigns, we have these things, we have searches, we have this. So why aren't things getting any better? What is it that we're not doing that we need to be doing, actually? All
right. Well, that's where we leave it on that topic. And when we return, we're going to discuss the latest on the Winnie Mandela's Kunu estate claims, as well as the Ebola threat to the AFCON tournament. And we wrap up with your tweets and also discuss what the panel thinks. We'll be making news headlines this coming week. You can still call us on +2 711 714 6847, 714 6843, and 714 6857. Share views and comments on Twitter at SA Media Monitor, as well as on Facebook. Don't go anywhere.
The Constitutional Court has upheld a decision to fire 2 senior Arms Corps executives. They were dismissed last year by Defence Minister. The court ruled that the 2 had failed to fulfill their mandate.
The North Gauteng High Court had previously said the minister's decision was irrational.
Suspected Boko Haram gunmen have reportedly kidnapped 20 women from a nomadic settlement near Chibok in northeast Nigeria.
Primetime News, daily at 6 p.m. on SABC News.
Welcome back to Media Monitor. You can also be part of our program and share views by calling us on +2711 714 6843, 714 6847 and 714 6857. In our next story, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, the ex-wife of former President Nelson Mandela's claim of entitlement of the late state President's Gunu estate has dominated newspapers and social media this week. All right, panel, finally, Winnie's out of mourning, now pursuing her claims to estate. Has the media even considered it, looking at both sides of the claim? Let's start with the traditional and legal aspect of things. Let's start with you, Wadim.
It came a bit of a surprise, the legal claim, and I suppose, you know, it is her right to challenge the will. I mean, that's basically how it goes. But I think because it comes as a surprise, I think, and because it's largely based on the papers that she has filed in court, there hasn't really been, you know, enough possibility to go and investigate it, because the only part of the information you have is what she's actually filed. So there's not been a responding affidavit, there's been no further commentary, and because the story we love this is now sub judice, you know, everybody is going to go and shut up and it's not going to go and say anything about that. So it's going to be very difficult to go and to deal with this in the absence of further information. So we have to go and see how the story develops. It's an interesting story because, you know, we always feel that, you know, you can't touch, you know, anyone or anything on Madiba. It's sacred. We can't go and look at this one. Here is, you know, the ex-wife challenging. It's going to be an interesting development. And as I said, I think we need to go and wait for what happens legally there.
All right, let's take our second caller, Tony from George. A very warm welcome to you. So please go ahead with your comments.
Thank you very much. I listened to your comments about the accidents in South Africa on the roads. Very interesting. And the only thing that concerns me about the whole thing is you only hear about accidents on the roads basically when Christmas comes around, when Easter comes around, when we have the scorecard on how many people we kill. In George a little while ago, a couple of guys were out night clubbing, went home. On the way home, had an accident, a couple were killed. Now, we all hear all the nonsense and stories about liquor and how they're going to handle liquor on the South Africa, but they don't do anything about it. Last year they were talking about liquor advertising and doing something about it. Nothing's happened. All we do is you hear a lot of talk, and I agree with that gentleman that said just now that we need to focus on this. A lot of people and a lot of families are being destroyed by people being killed on roads and some innocent people being killed. And it's not necessary at all in our country. If you look at our country and look at other countries throughout the world, we must be right up there on the scorecard and how many people we write off every year.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the information and for the discussion. Thank you.
You so much, Tony,
Bye-bye.
there for your input. It's very concerning indeed. Is there anything you want to add there, William?
Yeah, I think we should look at the real personal cost. You know, one of the advantages of this Oscar trial, going back to that, is that you get a real sense of what loss of a person is to people, because it's personalized, you know, and we don't do that with road accidents. The actual loss to that family of that mother, that father, that brother, that sister, that cousin, that aunt, that granny, whoever it is that dies so tragically in these things, we don't get that real sense of that. That comes in the news and it disappears. That family that's left, they have to live with that for the rest of their lives and to begin to deal with that trauma. And that's got a financial cost, but it also has a huge emotional cost for our nation. And it's something we really need to think about how we address.
All right, and getting back to our Winnie story, of course, let's talk about what are your observations around the revelations of the couple's fraudulent marriage and divorce certificate, William?
Well, I mean, it's certainly pretty explosive if it's accurate, and I'm not sure where to from here. I guess the critical point is as Wadima said, is that media often have a very favorable bias towards anything related to Madiba, and they need to make sure that they almost don't overdo themselves by allowing too negative a perception of Madiba to creep in their attempt to be not biased, I guess. So I think in the current instance we have to wait and see in this court case. Let's see what the opposing affidavits say and see from there. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about her precise terms of her claim to be able to say. I haven't read her court papers yet either, so I don't know.
Very interesting that you should say that, William. I wanted to say that South Africa has embraced Winnie as the mother of the nation with, of course, the latest revelations and allegations in the media. Is the media now doing their famous let's bring her down with scandal type of situation there? Wadim?
Well, I think they've tried it before. They've been keeping on trying it in terms of her performance, so-called performance in Parliament. I think Winnie Mandela is tried and tested. I think she knows how to go and deal with this, and she's going to go and deal with it as well. I think, you know, there's people that love her, there's people that are hating her. I think in this particular instance, we really need to go and stay away from our personal emotions that we have towards her or towards Madiba. And again, I'm pointing at some of the headlines that I'm seeing here in the City Press, which, you know, I really believe are just simply wrong from a journalistic point of view because they're expressing a specific opinion. She has a right to challenge that will. She has a right because she's been an ex-wife to Nelson Mandela. They've shared history, they've shared children, they've shared a life together. And we don't know the details, and we need to go and allow her as an individual, as a person, to go and challenge those details without putting our own personal bias and our own feeling towards her contribution history. And then let's go and judge her afterwards. I think at the moment we shouldn't.
It was a private family matters.
Yes.
William?
I don't know if they're private and we shouldn't look into them, but I think that we need to, so for example, around Madiba's funeral, there are all sorts of things there, that questions that really could have been raised, and perhaps at that time it wasn't the appropriate time to look at them, but we need to reflect on those things and address them. You know, suddenly you saw this wonderfully close relationship between Winnie and Graça Machel, you know, which was pretty extraordinary because you didn't generally see them hugging and being all warm together in normal social events. We need to unpack those things. There are all sorts of issues around the funeral itself and the kind of battles that we heard in the background that were going on that we need to unpack and say, well, how do we deal with these things in the future? Give these things some air, and then we might get a better understanding of what's really going on, because we know in the prior to Madiba's death, we know that there was all sorts of shenanigans going on around where he was going to be buried, around the burial site, around all sorts of issues, you know. So there's very contested space, and it's just deeply.
Some things were not followed up that we can now look forward to. All right, well, to our next story now. According to SAFA, no decision has been taken as to whether South Africa will host the 2015 Africa Cup of Nations. The official host, Morocco, has asked CAF to postpone the tournament, fearing the Ebola outbreak that is ravaging West African countries. All right, now, the involvement of Ebola from being just a health to now a social crisis. Has media really interrogated that? Wadim, let's start with you.
The answer is no. Firstly, just on the issue around SAFA, I think South Africa should be hosting the African Cup of Nations every time. I think apparently we've been doing it in any case as, you know, as one of the hosts for the others. But coming back by default, yeah, coming back in terms of, you know, the Ebola crisis, I think there's a lot of very poor information about Ebola out there, not just in our press, but in the international press. I was pointed to a story that was running around on Facebook and Twitter a while about a man that was holding a paperclip board, you know, following people in a hazmat suit who were transporting a patient, and an outcry in the social media, how can he not be in a suit, and, you know, he's going to go and be killed by Ebola because Ebola is airborne. Which it isn't. So there's a lot of misinformation about the disease. There's a lot of things that we don't know. I mean, even my 11-year-old son, who's developed a cough last week, has been telling me he needs to go to the doctor because he's worried about Ebola. Aww. So there's a lot of things, I'm just pointing it out, but there's a lot of things that we don't know, that we seemingly have got wrong. And I think, you know, we focused on the numbers, we focused on the stories in Texas, we focused on, you know, the individual aspects. But there's really a lot to go and be unpacked, not to go and create hype, but actually to de-hype it in terms of, you know, people, you know, telling people what it is really about and how to go and deal with it.
Give them the right information and don't create panic. I'll get back to you just now, William. Let's take Senzo from Durban on the line. Senzo, very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us. Your comment, please, sir.
Yes, good morning, sister.
Good morning, Mins. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can say, let me put it this way. I like the depot for the owner of the truck and and all those people which are involved in it in the transport. They must have another workshop. If we got a truck depot in Durban, he must have another truck depot in Joburg, so that if the trucks left here in Durban and then get into Joburg and then do the service in Joburg before you load another staff to bring it in Durban, so that maybe it's going to prevent the big accident which the trucks cause on the road.
Thank you so much. That's Senzo from Durban suggesting that maybe owners should provide two drivers. One drives halfway and the other drives halfway to try and prevent, of course, the fatigue. All right, now getting back to your earlier point, William, Wadim just mentioned there was misinformation about, of course, Ebola. There's also been contradicting media report about why Morocco is actually withdrawing from hosting the CAF Championship.
Yeah, it is quite a curious thing, but I mean, I know that there are a number of other international events that have been postponed because they're concerned about Ebola and West Africa, and particularly some of the travel restrictions. Then again, it mightn't be that they're concerned that people are going to get Ebola or that it's going to be transferred somehow, but that they're worried about their guests and the extra health requirements that are being imposed on certain people and how that's going to impact people. I think that, again, what we do understand is what happened to the person in Texas, what happened to the person in Europe, and etc. We don't have much better understanding about what's actually going on in countries on our own continent. We know that there's shortages of skills. We know that these and these and these things. So there are some really good pieces if you look for them. But I think in general terms, though, we need to make sure that it's not only our media that we expect to say, tell us everything about Ebola. We need public health campaigns about Ebola, how it spreads, what are the issues, what you do need to worry about, what you don't need to worry about. That starts to just set these things up in a little bit of perspective. We know that our government has got a national response plan. We need to know more detail about what that is. We need to know what the real kind of threats and issues are, and also how it gets transmitted, because there are those concerns. So it's not going to help just to have one news story that says this is how it's spread. People might miss that. You need ongoing messaging around an epidemic like this that's really starting to grow. And unless you have that kind of repeating messages, we're going to get the situation where people are going to get it wrong. They're going to be very unfortunate stories coming out.
Thank you, William. Let's take Tanya from Johannesburg. Tanya, thank you for staying on the line. Please go ahead with your comment. Hi, Tanya. Please go ahead with your comment. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, how are you?
We're very well, thank you, Tanya. Please go ahead with your comment, ma'am.
Well, I like to say that the AFCON Cup shouldn't come to South Africa because of this Ebola virus. I mean, just imagine a whole lot of people in one space. I mean, that's kind of dangerous for all of us. So I think that it's a really bad idea.
All right, thank you so much. That's Tanya, a very young voice giving us her views. What do you want to say there, William? Do you agree?
It's good that we have a young person calling in, but I think the concern is to sort of go into this reclusive thing and say, no, we shouldn't be hosting it here. We're talking about footballers. Footballers don't live in the normal world that ordinary citizens live in. They live in these funny palaces and all bizarre places. You know, they're not ordinary citizens. The people that are catching Ebola are not people that are living footballers' lives. Let's be clear about this, right? So you need to take those kinds of things into consideration. Why wasn't the same scare being talked about when we said, oh, look, a church has collapsed in Nigeria? Should we be bringing those bodies back? Oh, no, what if they all have Ebola because they've been in Nigeria? You know, that kind of thing is clearly impractical. We need to just make sure we get these things in perspective and communicate what's really going on.
Wait, but William, Morocco's concerns, shouldn't we be in solidarity with them? I mean, South Africa is always, they count on South Africa to sort of play the big brother in terms of, such situations, but we do have a health pandemic that is totally ravaging the West African countries. What do you...
Yeah, we do, but I think, obviously, as an economic hub, on the continent, I've got quite a lot of things in place in terms of managing, the outbreak of diseases or the influx of people, the outflux of people, and I think there's a general recognition that, we've handled big events, we've handled the World Cup, we've handled, all kinds of things, and we are probably, very well prepared on this continent to go and handle that one, and I suppose it's right. Again, I think, speaking to what William says, I think we should know more about what it is that we're doing. But one of the things that we need to go and remember is even if we are hosting AFCON here or if we don't, there's far more people coming to South Africa on a daily basis through normal borders or through air borders that have got nothing to do with the AFCON. So the AFCON is certainly not going to go and mean that suddenly we're going to go and have people from those areas emerging in hundreds and thousands. We need to go and contain them. We already have that. So from that point of view, it doesn't really make any difference. I just think that there's probably a field that we can go and handle it better than a Morocco, which has got, probably not the same type of experience in hosting.
Look, if I can just quote the Minister of Sports, Mr. Fikile Mbalula, he said there are just too many factors to consider for South Africa if we are to host a tournament of this magnitude. Our major concern is the cost implication of such a tournament when South Africa is currently grappling with its own fiscal challenges. So it's not just looking at Ebola and saying, no, we don't want to help other countries because they have the Ebola virus. William?
Yeah, I suspect it's more about the money. And in football, international sport generally, but football certainly, it's always about the money. It's very rarely actually about the sport. If FIFA was so terribly concerned about football, maybe they'd channel some of that millions of rands that they launder through all of their Swiss bank accounts into actually addressing the Ebola pandemic. We've seen countless calls by African governments about saying international donors, they're saying they're giving money to combat Ebola. They need to actually give that money to Ebola and not withhold on the other money that they've already dedicated, but it needs to be in addition to. These are some of the real big questions that we need to talk about Ebola, because that's the thing that allows it to spread. It's about those basic conditions. There were stories in our news about how they have X many thousands of suits, whereas in fact they need X million numbers of suits in order to help combat this. Now, without that kind of thing, it's just going to get bigger.
All right. Well, that's where we leave it, unfortunately, panel. But thank you so much for your views. Let's just take some of the tweets now that some of our loyal viewers have written to us on the topics today. Faith Dube says, oh, there is freedom of speech, all right. It's freedom after the speech that is not guaranteed. Faith Dube, thank you so much for your input there. Mhlale says, it's not in the DNA of any media to pioneer freedom in respect of political economy. Thank you so much, then, Mhlale. And Carla, of course, at Skopje says, Nel cannot speak for all society, arrogant to assume, not fair to have different standards because Oscar Pistorius is famous. Thank you so much to Carla. Jean Delayri says, then we must be fair. If you kill one in a car accident, you must also go to jail. Thank you so much, Jan Delayri. Mazwai Voklega says, but media does report unworthy roads. Pity, no one cares about it. Media does expose drunken drivers. Salute on that. And last but not least, Chrissy B says, I think AFCON should be cancelled. Risk of spreading Ebola is too high with visitors from West African countries. And that's all your contributions there by our viewers. Very quickly, panel, what do you anticipate will be making news headlines? Let's start with you, William.
Well, hopefully Ebola will stay on the news agenda and it'll get some more coverage. But
what would you like to see in terms of that coverage this week?
I'd like to see them unpacking it, challenging some of the kinds of things that we've just heard there about this idea that we shouldn't host it because of the spread. As Wadim pointed out, there are thousands of people crossing borders. Let's make sure that that we have the right systems in place, that we have the right means to address it if and when someone does actually come into our country who has Ebola. Let's look at that.
Thank
I
you.
think we're likely to see Winnie getting big again, and we're likely to, hopefully we'll see issues around food security staying on our news agenda.
Just one for you, Wadim.
Oscar.
What do you want
to say? It's going to happen on Tuesday. We're going to be talking Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and we'll be the biggest legal experts on appeal processes in the country, us readers.
All right, and we'll see it again right here on Media Monitor next week, Sunday. Well, thank you so much, panel, for views. And our viewers' contributions and suggestions is highly valued. You can follow us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor and share views and comments on Facebook. Go to www.facebook.com/Media Monitor and like our Facebook page. You can also email us your views about the show to mediamonitor@sabc.co.za. Thank you so much for watching Media Monitor today. Join us again next week right here on the SABC News channel. Just in case you missed our live show, remember, you can still catch the repeat show tomorrow morning at 2 a.m. or go to our SABC YouTube link on www.youtube.com/SABC News. For myself, Alicia Jali, and the rest of the QTIV team, have yourself a blessed Sunday. Goodbye.